I guess as the first keynote speaker at the conference, I should provide you with a sense of uplift and mission. I should have sort of worn a white suit and come on like a kind of evangelist, or at least perhaps in the context of a media conference, I should be trying to sell you some sort of fashionable theory or some bit of technology that's going to transform all of our lives. The alternative, which I have chosen today, is actually to abandon all technology and just talk. And to try to provoke you, or at least to try to provoke some controversy or perhaps just annoy you. I think I will have failed in my role if I haven't said at least one thing that I hope you profoundly agree with, and then perhaps one thing that you equally profoundly disagree with. I have to go off tomorrow to talk to parents and students on a UCAS day about the wonders of media studies. So you can curse me when I'm gone, or, well, you can curse me later, although I'm probably going to use up all my time. My title was is The Success and Failure of Media Education, which I've stolen actually from a book by the art critic John Berger about Picasso. I won't pretend that I've read that book, but I thought it was quite a nice formulation, because I want to talk about success, but I also want to talk about failure. I want to do more than just celebrate the wonderful things we all do, but I also want to look at what we might be doing wrong, or at least ask some questions about that. Seems to me that at the moment, for a variety of reasons, media educators are on the defensive. Some of us have been doing this for a long, long time, but we still find ourselves under attack, ridiculed and derided within the public debate. We increasingly, it seems, have to be fighting our corner. Now, I think we can and should respond to that by proclaiming the value, the importance of what we all do, but I think perhaps we should also be taking a bit of time to reflect and ask ourselves some questions. Earlier this year, at the MEXA conference, James Curran gave a very articulate defence of media studies, which you can read online, and some of what he said I will be responding to. I don't actually want to disagree with a lot of what he was saying, but I think I probably will be giving a bit more time to the failure as well as the success. Worth noting that James Curran's defence was a defence of media studies, that is, of the academic discipline, whereas my concern is with media education, with questions about teaching and learning about media. I'm interested, and we'll talk about teaching and learning at all levels, but my key point in a way is that we can't separate teaching and learning from the academic discipline. And I'm also interested in adding schools into that picture, which is something that James Curran, I think, conspicuously failed to mention. So I want to raise a few questions about this defence of media studies or media education. Why are we still defending media education? What are we defending? Are we all defending the same thing? And actually, is it all defensible at the end of the day? Now, in talking about failures and problems, I hope it goes without saying I'm not doing this in order to trash media education or to belittle what we all do. But it's more that I think if all we do is simply defend ourselves, we may run the risk of ignoring some rather difficult questions. Okay, let's start with the success. I think we could probably all do the positive bit in our sleep. There are times when the criticisms just mount up. You know, you hear John Humphreys on the Today programme making some passing snide comment about media studies and dumbing down, and you just snap. I did that a few years ago, actually. I wrote an article for The Guardian's Comment is Free online, which I think came out as in defence of media studies. If you ever do this, I recommend that you avoid going online to look at the responses. It's the kind of thing that makes you lose the will to live. You know, if you ever had any sort of vestigial sentimental belief in the democratic potential of new media, that will well and truly put paid to it. We all know the stuff about the importance of the media to society, to the economy, to politics, to everyday life. I think the implication that somehow we would not or should not be studying something as self-evidently important as media which seems to be some people's argument. It just seems like not just a reactionary argument, but a completely bizarre one. There's a lot of evidence of the success of media studies as a subject. When they get the choice, students clearly want to do it, not because they're just wasters or fantasists or badly informed or misled, as some people seem to suggest. No, they want to do it because, like us, they know that the media are pretty much central to social life in the modern world. It's obvious. Media studies in higher education has expanded quite dramatically over the past 20 years, although actually once you start to look at the evidence, it's a bit mixed. There was a report last year by the Higher Education Policy Institute which found that the number of universities offering media studies courses had tripled between 1996 and 2009. The number of applications for those courses had doubled, outstripping expansion in the sector more generally. On the other hand, there was a report 2011 by Universities UK, and here they're working with this category mass communications and documentation. But within that category, numbers had grown by just under 20% since 2003. And there the argument is, well, actually this is not much more than the average across the sector, and actually significantly less than in the so-called STEM subjects. In fact, what we've seen is an expansion of the subject, but the expansion would seem to be pretty much in step with the expansion of higher education in general. The proportion of media studies students relative to other subjects has remained fairly constant, and according to that report, it's about 3%. Still, we've seen some growth, and I think there's a question, which I will come back to, is whether that growth will be sustained in the world of £9,000 a year students. Equally, expansion in schools has, until fairly recently, been fairly phenomenal. The numbers taking AS and A2 examinations under the last government, up till about 2010, grew fourfold, although obviously they started from a very low point. More recently, exam board statistics show that there's been an increase of about 15% since between 2007 and 2010. Actually now less marked than in other subjects, and there has been a drop-off. We're beginning to see now a drop-off, and that's something I want to come back to. So a picture of expansion, but where's that going? I think we can also argue that media studies, or perhaps cultural studies, has been very successful as an academic discipline. It has had a profound and lasting influence on a whole range of other areas: sociology, art history, geography, literature. James Curran, in his talk, pointed out that also British media studies has been influential globally, and that's measured by the number of international students who want to come here to study in this area. And I guess when we look at media education, we could probably say the same thing. The British model of media education, if I can talk about it in that way, you know, the BFI approach, key concepts, media literacy, that approach that developed really in the 80s and 90s, has actually informed media education globally. So, you know, forget the iron and steel industry. Britain leads the world in media education. And yet, the criticisms don't go away. And if anything, it seems that the more successful, or at least the more widespread media education seems to be, the more virulent the criticism becomes. Media studies, as we all know, is a very easy target. It's a byword for triviality, for dumbing down, for the degenerate, celebrity-obsessed, loser-take-all culture that modern Britain has now become. Actually, there's a history of all of this too. 15 years ago, Martin Barker wrote a very nice chapter in the book Ill Effects called On the Problems of Being a Trendy Travesty, where he systematically analysed the media coverage of media studies. You know, the complaints we've all heard about a Mickey Mouse subject, you know, this discourse of derision he talks about was pretty much everywhere. And in fact, you know, I can go back further. 20 years ago, when Julian Sefton Green and I wrote a book called Cultural Studies Goes to School, it was very easy for us to begin that book by finding similar kind of arguments around. And in fact, we started with something some people will remember, a Tory education minister foaming at the mouth about the use of a McDonald's advertisement in an English exam. They'd give us Chaucer with chips, Milton with mayonnaise, he said. You know, I think that probably went down better at the Bullingdon Club than here. You know, this continues. So James Curran in his talk, Dan Lockey in a presentation at the Media Literacy Conference in London a couple of years ago, provided lots of examples of people like Andrew Marr, John Humphreys, Polly Toynbee, Janet Street Porter, as well as politicians right across the political spectrum, turning out this discourse of derision. And from this perspective, it would seem that there's no way that media studies could ever be a serious subject. The content is trivial, and therefore the study of that content itself is trivial. Media studies is a soft option. It's one of those easy subjects as compared with the hard subjects which we all know. Yet at the same time as it's condemned for being insufficiently academic, it is also condemned for being insufficiently vocational. Doing media studies won't get you a job in the media. Now, for somebody of my now advanced years, you know, this is tiresome, but also a bit strange, really. It's a bit strange that we're still having this argument. I mean, for me, I studied English at an exceptionally posh university. A couple of years later, I was teaching media studies, CSE, if you remember that, in a secondary school, while in the evenings studying to do a master's in film and television studies. That was, I have to confess, 35 years ago. I was very young at the time, but my point is that, you know, we've been around for a long time, and the argument, the criticism, has been around for a long time. So why? You know, why are we still in this place? Why do we seem to have made so little headway in establishing the legitimacy of what we're doing? James Curran, in his talk, rightly said that these critiques are essentially based on ignorance. I mean, they misrepresent what media studies involves. They're not based on any information or knowledge. They're just based on prejudice. The people who make these arguments haven't done any research in the area. They haven't talked to anybody who knows about it. They actually have no idea of what we do, and they're not ashamed of that. As James Curran also said, studying media is, or can be, intellectually demanding. It's certainly not about just sitting around watching telly or talking about who you fancy on Geordie Shore. It's a cross-disciplinary field. It draws on bodies of knowledge and theory from psychology, history, sociology, aesthetics, linguistics, etc. It's difficult. This is not a soft option, or at least it's not a soft option if you're going to do well. Media studies, we'd also want to say, can be, media studies graduates can also be quite employable, although it's something I'll come back to because I think the evidence there is rather mixed. But in terms of offering skills for employability rather than just narrowly technical skills, media studies, I think, does much better than many other subjects. And yet, we can make these arguments till we're blue in the face, but it seems as though we're still having to defend ourselves. According to James Curran, that is because these criticisms are actually a reflection of the insecurities of journalists, a response to the fact that journalists' own jobs, their own status and legitimacy are increasingly insecure. So lashing out at media studies makes them feel better. I'm not so sure about that, really. It seems to me an argument that rather overstates our own importance, and overstating our own importance is, I think, an endemic problem in the field. Most of our critics, who are by no means only journalists, don't see media studies as a big threat, a big challenge to their own power. They just see it as an irrelevance. Media studies is a joke. And they're confident that in referring to that, in making that joke, they know that their readers will instantly recognise it. So, we need to defend ourselves against that kind of thing, but I don't think that that should preclude some hard thinking, some critical reflection about what we're doing. And I think this is particularly the case when we try and look at this from an educational perspective, when we think about media education, teaching and learning, rather than just media studies. It's a strange line in James Curran's talk where he says that he's always avoided responding to these kinds of criticism on the grounds that, I quote, discussion about education is best left to those in education departments. It's as though academics are not actually educators at all, as though the whole business of the subject field, the content, is separate from the pedagogy. And that is a position which I'm afraid is rather typical. So, having painted a brief picture of success, I think we also need to acknowledge the potential, perhaps the reality, of failure. I think, in particular, there may be trouble ahead. I think we can no longer be so confident about the continuing expansion and success of the field. And just to give you some indicators of that, starting at a school level, student numbers at GCSE actually hit a plateau quite some time ago. We have now, seen the back of the EBAC, but what the EBAC represented is still around, a very clear institutionalised hierarchy of subjects at this level. Numbers at GCSE have declined recently. It's entirely possible they may decline further. Student numbers at A2 have also been falling for the last 3 years. AS is about to disappear. Now, again, there may be a temporary levelling off in the numbers, but hard to say. More broadly, there are moves to downgrade the value of media studies and other so-called soft subjects relative to so-called hard subjects in terms of university entry. So, as we know, there are some elite universities, including universities, I might say, that actually teach and research media, like the LSE and Oxford, universities that refuse to recognise media studies as a valid subject in the first place. Most recently, we've seen, both at GCSE and A-level, a renewed emphasis on the terminal exam, the impending demise of coursework. Coursework is pretty much gone at GCSE, although the situation at A-level is going to take longer to evolve. But I think the demise of coursework is going to make media studies more difficult to teach and less attractive to students. There was, need I remind you, the absolute fiasco of the creative and media diploma. I think the reasons for the demise of the diploma go beyond media education, but they also reflect the rather awkward position and the low status of media education as a field. In higher education, it seemed last year that undergraduate numbers were starting to drop. That may have been a temporary blip. It may have been a function of the introduction of the tripling of tuition fees. But I think it's likely that £9,000 a year students are going to be affected by claims that are being made in the debate about the vocational value or the lack of vocational value of particular subjects. Higher education, I would say, is also massively and dangerously dependent on postgraduate students, which primarily means international students. Still a growing market, but I use the word advisedly, a market. Meanwhile, if we look beyond media studies, the place of media education within the subject of English looks weaker than it has done for a long time. In fact, the government's latest consultation document for GCSE English predictably says nothing at all about media, but it actually includes the timeless line, digital texts will not be permitted. So you're not allowed to, if you think about the implications of that, it's fantastic. In primary schools, we've, for a long time, had a literacy curriculum that focuses exclusively on print literacy. We might once, I think, have looked to communication policy for some kind of recognition, but media literacy, which was part of Ofcom's remit, I would say is now pretty much dead in the water. Or at least it's been reduced to a very functional concern with online safety and access, a notion that really has very little to do with our broader notion of what media literacy or media education might be about. And lastly, while I'm on this kind of gloomy story, I need to be careful with what I say here, the BFI, which is the key, I think has been the key organisation in the field for the last 50 years, now seems to be franchising out most of its education work to an industry organisation called Film Nation, which not only reduces media education to film education, but seems to be primarily premised on getting kids to watch films and make them, but rather than any of the kind of critical approach that most of us would see as central to media education. I'd like to be optimistic about what will happen there. There's a large amount of money going into it, and it would be nice to see that it was not quite as desperate as I'm suggesting. Now, I could go on and just lead us all into sort of terminal depression, but my point is that we may be seeing at least a turn in the tide here. I think it's implausible that in 10 years, in 20 years, people will not be studying the media, but it's entirely possible that media education will not become the basic core curriculum entitlement that we imagined it would and should become. Media education may remain still a relatively low status, relatively marginal area on the fringes of the curriculum. I think if we're going to understand what's happening here, it's important to look historically and also comparatively at other curriculum subjects. Where do subjects or disciplines come from? How are they established? How do they achieve legitimacy? How do they take the form that they do? How does the trajectory of development of a subject determine what that subject becomes, what it can and cannot do? I think if we look at it this way, what we very quickly see is that this process of subject formation is contingent, it's uneven, it's provisional. What media education is, what it has become, what it might in future become, has been shaped not only by us, by practitioners, by thinkers, by the internal development of the field, but also by external forces, by the wider politics of education, the wider political and cultural context. Now, thinking about this, I went back and reread Terry Bolas's book from a couple of years ago, Screen Education from Film Appreciation to Media Studies, and it at least gave me some quite interesting pause for thought about all of this. For people who haven't seen the book, it's actually not so much a history of media education, but rather a history of a key organisation in the field, the Society for Education in Film and Television, CEFT. Which began life in 1950 as the Society of Film Teachers and was eventually wound up at the end of the 1980s, paradoxically at a point where media education was really just starting to take off. Now, CEFT was funded at arm's length by the British Film Institute, and Terry's book, I would say, has a rather specialised appeal, for people who are obsessively interested in the political infighting that took place within a sort of 400-yard radius of Old Compton Street in Soho, among whom I count myself. I would say, it's really what you want to read, but perhaps not for everybody. It's also, I would say, quite a descriptive history. I don't think Terry actually asks enough critical questions about the role of state-funded cultural institutions like the BFI. I think he's also rather nostalgic about the radical self-image of media studies, this rather sort of vainglorious view of film and television studies as some kind of dissident, subversive, progressive political movement. Although, to be fair, that was something that we all believed at the time. What I think is especially interesting about Terry's book, in terms of what I want to argue here, is that he locates the origin of all of this in schools. Film appreciation, which is where he starts, began in schools in the 1930s, in the absence, needless to say, of any kind of teacher training, well before it was established in universities. CEFT, the organisation, was run by a small group of teacher pioneers, some of whom, yes, driven by a rather sort of self-righteous desire to protect children from harmful media influences, although, as he shows, they from a quite early stage had a broader commitment to a the importance, the value of film and later television as a medium. The point is that the academic study of those media began rather later, at least as a distinct subject discipline, media studies, or to begin with, film studies. I mean, there's a longer history of media research, but the separate discipline in higher education is actually rather more recent. And what we saw and what he traces in the book is the argument being made within CEFT and within the British Film Institute that media education needed to have a coherent theoretical basis. And a shift happened during, really in the 70s, away from schools towards higher education. So in the late 60s into the 70s, the BFI began to put its educational resources into supporting developments in higher education. And CEFT, the organisation he looks at, became a key means of doing this. It was very much a disciplinary project, if you like. It was about establishing the legitimacy of the subject through achieving a place for it within the academy. Now, Terry's history stops with the demise of CEFT in 1989, which is shockingly almost 25 years ago. But my point would be that many of the issues and many of the problems that appear in that history are still around. And I think the key one is the problematic relationship between media education in schools and media education in higher education. Despite its name, Society for Education in Film and Television, CEFT was effectively dominated by a cadre of avant-garde radical intellectuals. They would actually have refused the term academics, but most of them eventually became academics. These were people with, and I speak from bitter experience, with a complete lack of interest in what happened in schools and, I would say, in education more generally. Education was not only part of what we used to call the ideological state apparatus, it was just hopelessly unglamorous. And of course, academics weren't really involved in this grubby business of education anyway. So most of the organisation's resources, the BFI money, went into the publication of the academic journal Screen. And whatever else one may say about Screen, you know, it was a journal that was notorious for its impenetrable prose. And indeed, I would say there was at the time a self-conscious resistance to clarity in writing, as though making yourself understood was somehow tantamount to bourgeois empiricism. I think there's actually a serious, I mean, we can laugh, but there is a serious issue here about the pedagogy of academic writing and actually the pedagogy of politics, really. You know, we all thought we were engaged in a form of revolutionary cultural activism, you know, reading Lacan, publishing these things in Screen, a kind of political posturing that, when you look at it in retrospect, just seems ridiculous, but actually was quite terrorising at the time. And it was I was very involved in the 80s. I have a kind of walk-on part at the end of Terry's book. I was involved in a struggle to try to get CEFT to address education. And I think at the end we lost that struggle. It was impossible for that struggle to be resolved, and that, I would say, accounts for the demise of the organisation. That's probably my interpretation more than Terry's. Now, you can look at all of this with the condescension of hindsight, or with a kind of mix of horror and perhaps nostalgia, you know, but all that wasted effort, really. But my point is that I don't think we've entirely outlived all of this. Some of the problems that arose in the formation of the subject are still around, and I'll come back to that. Now, I think Terry's book would have been much more enriched if he'd actually done the comparative thing, if he'd compared the formation of media studies with the formation of other subjects. Clearly, different subjects have different trajectories, different patterns of development. And in fact, one of the other things I looked at in thinking about this was that, you know, there's a literature within the sociology of education, really going back to the 1980s, where people have looked at this subject, the evolution of subject disciplines within the curriculum. People like Ivor Goodson, Stephen Ball. What these people were doing was looking sociologically at the process of subject formation, how subjects work as social systems, how they emerge and how they change. And they did that by looking quite materially at things like textbooks and syllabuses and the work of subject associations, teacher training, and so on. If you go back slightly before this, the so-called new sociology of education in the 1970s, people like Michael Young, Basil Bernstein to some extent, that work tended to present subjects in a rather monolithic way, as internally coherent and also, as needless to say, as agents of hegemony. Whereas what the sociology of the 1980s began to do was to recognise that it's more complicated than that. Within the academy, disciplines are often fragmented and divided rather than coherent and consensual. There are competing paradigms and subgroupings, different social worlds, different structures, what we might now call academic tribes. So subjects are not monolithic. And certainly when we look at school subjects, other imperatives come into play. Different interest groups are involved, not just academics and teachers, but also managers, policymakers, sometimes industry groups, awarding bodies, and so on. So what a school subject becomes, not least in terms of its status, is often tied up with issues of material resources, teachers' careers, the allocation of funding within the education system. The whole process of defining a subject, and particularly of defining what counts as knowledge in a subject, what is legitimate, what carries status, is something that's very contingent, very contested. So there's an interesting article by Ivor Goodson which looks at geography, which we might imagine has always been there. And what he traces is actually how geography moved over a period of about 50 years from being a low-status school subject to a subject that was established in universities. There are actually quite interesting parallels, I think, with media education here, although some interesting differences. What's interesting about this is the role of the subject association, the geographical association. It is crucial in pushing this drive for legitimacy, in lobbying for teachers to get proper training, lobbying for the subject to be recognised in the exam system. And what you get is an interesting struggle, which really surfaces in the 1960s around the so-called new geography, between these different these different definitions of the subject, particularly between an academic definition of geography and one that comes out of schools, what he calls, Ivor Goodson calls, a more utilitarian definition. I'm not sure that's the right word, but a definition that argues that the subject is really, what's really important is how the subject connects with the ways in which students live their everyday lives, how it provides them with, if you like, really useful knowledge. So there's a process of struggle going on here. There are other things. There's actually another interesting article by Barry Cooper about maths, about modern maths in the 1960s, and probably most relevant here, Stephen Ball's series of articles about English. And I think, again, interesting to look at because it explodes the idea of the curriculum as a set of sort of unchanging tablets of stone. It raises the question of how school subjects become established. So Stephen Ball looks at really the power struggles involved in establishing English as a legitimate subject. In the early days, in competition with classics within universities, and then the struggle between different versions of English established in different contexts for different kinds of students with different objectives or different cultural aims. And again, I think an interesting theme running through it is the relationship between schools and universities. F.R. Leavis, who we all now, like to spit on, was a key figure in all of this, and actually played a very interesting role through the use of English, which was a journal published for teachers, and you also had a subject association, the English Association, playing a really important role. Now, when you look at it, of course, it's all about elites. It's about private school teachers. It's about the great and the good. It's about authors, although interestingly not publishers, different forces involved. But nevertheless, I think there are interesting kind of parallels and differences. I'm not actually, I was thinking about this and thinking, has anybody done that with sociology? I think it might be interesting to I think we might find rather different relationships between the academic discipline and the subject in schools, where it still has quite a marginal and problematic place. You know, what's the relationship between sociology, as taught in universities, and, well, I guess it would be PSHE, taught in schools. Now, I would say that if we wanted to do all of this work now, oh my God, is that the time? If we wanted to do all of this work now, you know, the picture would be much more messy. The role of universities is obviously weaker, although I think it takes a different form. You might recall that the Russell Group universities recently published a guide on what they called informed choices at A-level. Education has obviously become much more subject to direct political intervention, but in the context of a more marketised system, what we also have is privatised awarding bodies, commercial publishers, media companies, you know, the Pearsons of this world, often working in concert, as well as a whole cadre of entrepreneurs of various kinds, advisors, consultants, many of them effectively private companies in their own right. I was going to have a little digression about, I'm going to say this anyway. I think one of the particular issues, that, the particular forms that takes in media education, and it's apparent when I look at the programme actually, is about the relation between media and technology. So much of it seems to be technology driven. Now actually this isn't new. You look at Terry Bolas's book and he argues that the development of media education was tied up with and often confused with the argument for educational media. So through the mid-20th century, you were having people arguing for the educational uses of film and television, what we used to call audiovisual aids. And for media educators interested in studying these media, this was a kind of bridgehead. It was an opportunity to make their point, to promote media education within the curriculum. But they were also bound to distance themselves from that more functional use of media as tools, if you like. I actually think we're in a similar place with technology, with digital media in this respect. I mean, it's partly because ICT in education has so massively and successfully overtaken media education, partly because it's been so energetically pursued by commercial companies. And I think we've been rather wrong-footed by all of this. And there's no doubt, I would have no doubt that technology is offering more space, particularly for creative media production, although again, that's not exactly new. But there's very little space in any of this for critical reflection on media or technology. I think we've been rather suckered by a feel-good rhetoric about technological creativity. Sorry, that was a digression. Back to the formation of the subject. What I take from all of this is that the establishment and hence the defence of a subject is always a complex, a contested matter. There are different versions of the subject or the field or the discipline, if you like, promoted by quite different interest groups with different imperatives, located in quite different social structures, social worlds. So we can defend media studies, but actually very often we're not defending the same thing. My own feeling is that if we want to defend media education, then we need to do more than just emphasise its academic disciplinary credentials, its status as really difficult knowledge. I think we have to defend it as an educational pedagogic practice, not least because it's actually the pedagogic practice that seems to be the focus of so much of the criticism. And that, it seems to me, involves asking pedagogical questions about teaching and learning. And I would say, particularly in higher education, there's been a neglect of those kinds of questions. These are the questions that should really be left to people who work in education departments. They're not for the likes of us. I think this is a mistake because it leaves us vulnerable to criticism, to the charges of dumbing down and soft options. And I would say that I think teachers in schools who inevitably think about these things might actually have something to offer to academics in respect of all of this. So what I'm going to do in the time that remains, and probably in the half hour after it's finished, is to just kind of ask a few of the kind of questions that I feel need to be said about this. And actually I am going to, picking up on what Brian said, I want to say in particular a few things about theory and practice and the relations between them. That's not because I accept a distinction between theory and practice. And indeed, part of my point is that that's a problematic distinction, but it is a distinction that's there in the field. So some very basic questions. Practice, firstly. What do we teach when we teach practice? Do we teach technological skills? Do we teach conceptual processes that transfer across media, like, for example, editing or narrative construction? Do we teach creativity, whatever that is and however we think it might be taught? Why do we even bother to teach practice at all? My son has just finished a theory practice media degree at a leading university which shall remain nameless, but a Russell Group university. And he maintains that he was taught nothing whatsoever on the practical part of the course that he couldn't have learned from YouTube tutorials. And indeed, that YouTube tutorials were actually more in-depth and more up-to-date than his lecturers could ever hope to be. And I mean, there's a serious point here, which is that, you know, in a world of instantly accessible, easy-to-use production technology, do we really need to teach this stuff at all? And if we do, then how and why do we need to teach it? Or to ask the question the other way around, what do students learn when they do practice? What can they do that they couldn't do before or that they couldn't have done anyway? And especially, I think a key issue is how do we know that they've learnt it and how do we evaluate it? Again, my son froths at the mouth about the stupid reflective essay that he had to write about his film production. And also the fact that he was given a group mark for his practical project, despite the fact that some of the other students in the group were complete wasters, just like it had been for him at GCSE and A-level. Now, I mean, clearly, you know, this is not a representative sample. N equals 1. But I think, you know, I think there are some problems that we might want to think about. I think we actually, if we had better answers to these questions, what are we teaching? Why are we bothering to teach? What are students learning? And not just answers that depend on the vocational argument, which I'll come on to. I think if we had better answers to those questions, we might be better prepared to respond to criticism. I want to ask some of the same questions about theory. What do we teach when we teach theory? And why are we teaching theory in the first place? Are we aiming to provide students with tools to think with? Are we aiming to enable students to theorize, to think critically or theoretically? Or are we giving them access to a body of legitimate discourse, a canon of approved individual theorists? So we don't teach Citizen Kane or The Searchers or Hitchcock, but we do teach, well, you name it, Foucault or Bourdieu or Anthony Giddens. So what are we teaching? What is this theory? Where does this theory come from? One of the odd things about James Curran's defence, which I keep referring to, is that he doesn't look at the political economy of the academic curriculum. I mean, he's one of the people who looks at the political economy of the media. Media studies may be doing very well, but it's doing so at a time when universities have effectively become privatised, or at least comprehensively marketised. We're all, let's face it, in a cutthroat competition to pile in students, to publish or perish, to achieve excellence. And media studies attempts to establish its own legitimacy as a serious academic subject, I would say, have had serious adverse consequences in terms of the accessibility or the lack of it of academic writing and the primacy that is afforded to particular versions of theory. And that goes back to screen, but I would say it's still with us. Perhaps one reason, this is very provocative, perhaps one reason why media studies is so reviled by the media is not because they see it as a dangerous political threat, but because media academics tend to talk and write in such ridiculously pompous and pretentious ways. I would recommend, if you haven't seen it, Mick Billig's new book, which is called Learning to Write Badly, How to Succeed in the Social Sciences. See, I mean, it sounds like a polemic, but it's a fantastic book. So, you know, what is this theory? How do students learn theory? I mean, in schools, but I would say also in universities. Students generally have relatively little direct contact with theory. What they have are textbooks in all but name. They have second or third hand summaries of key theorists as parodied, but also to some extent perhaps promoted in David Gauntlet's famous theory trading cards. There's a question here. What kind of writing and thinking and arguing are we promoting here? And okay, then let's put together theory and practice. What are the connections between theory and practice? How are theory and practice related? Are we making those connections effectively? Or are students being effectively left to make those connections for themselves? In higher education, there are typically theory courses and practice courses. And while there are mixed or combined courses, those two components are almost always taught by different people. There's no integration, except perhaps we imagine in the minds of the students. The picture is more complicated in schools, and I think we've been thinking about this issue for a longer time. But even here, I would say there is a real continuing problem with how the two relate to each other. Often it seems as though the theory stops and the practice starts, or vice versa. Now, we'd all pay lip service to the idea that there should be a dynamic relation between theory and practice. But actually, how does that relationship work out pedagogically? We could say we're looking for critical practice. But what is critical practice? How would we recognise critical practice when we saw it? And without ranting too much, my feeling is that a lot of the technologically driven creativity that people now seem to confuse with media education is quite a long way from critical practice, whatever that might be. And finally, to come back to the question of, well, what do students do with any of this? I think we have to ask this question, but I think we need to resist the reduction of it to a vocational issue. There was a newspaper report recently in The Independent which trashed media studies on the grounds that only 1 in 9 media graduates actually get jobs in the media industries. And it compared media studies with medicine, where, of course, 96, 98% get jobs. Actually, I think the more interesting comparison would be with English or history. Nobody asks how many English graduates become poets or novelists, or how many history students become historians, or even work in jobs where their knowledge of history might be remotely relevant. I think we are in a complicated and changing situation here. I mean, you could say that in a marketised system, the whole model of liberal education in the humanities is really finished, past its sell-by date. In the age of £9,000 a year students, where students have been told that they will have to pay for higher education because it will help them to land a better paid job and it will increase their lifetime earnings. In that kind of context, the vocational question is going to be on the agenda. And I think we have to acknowledge that it's also part of the rationale for media education. We might view media studies as, an all-round liberal education, but at least most of our students are doing it in the expectation that it will lead to jobs in the media. I teach now on a BSc in Media and Communications, note the BSc, that has no practical component. It's historically really distanced itself from practice. It presents itself as an academic social science degree. And like our social science colleagues in general, we are now having to think about employability. Now, I think actually once you start to look at it, there's quite a lot, even on an essentially academic degree, that gives students skills for the workplace. They might not know one end of a camera from another, although I would say that most of them undoubtedly do that and they will have cameras in their pockets anyway. But we hope they're also learning to write, to do research, to present information and arguments in different forms and so on. One of the problems also with this vocational debate is that the whole nature of employment and work in the media industries has changed very significantly. The industry has effectively become casualised. There's a lot of work, but there are fewer and fewer jobs. And getting that work entails quite particular skills. Not so much technical skills, but skills of self-presentation, of networking, a kind of social capital in a way. Now, I think there is a real danger that the expansion of media education or the growth of media education leads to an overproduction of graduates, all competitively chasing a limited amount of work, many of them prepared to work under conditions that amount to little more than exploitation. That may be an increasing problem generally, and perhaps particularly in arts-related areas, so we're not unique in that respect, but there is a danger that we offer students false promises, or at least that they arrive with false assumptions. Okay, I'm going to finish actually. My apologies if this was not the evangelical call for arms that you were expecting. I think what you've got is a rather sort of neurotic explosion of self-doubt. I think they asked the wrong guy, myself. I mean, where do we go? Where do we go from here? I find it hard to be optimistic, although, as a relic of CEFT and the 1970s, I fall back always on the old Gramscian motto, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. I think there are two things I'm saying. Firstly, in response to James Curran, I'm saying that I think we need to sharpen our arguments, and particularly that we need to make those arguments in educational or pedagogical terms. It's not enough to say that, yes, the media are really, really important. There's a lot of really complicated academic research about the media. I actually think we need to have much better arguments about what and how students learn about media at whatever level. And we need to argue that what they learn has a much broader relevance and applicability. I guess the other, and this will be the final point, the other thing that you might take from this is about overcoming separations. I think at various points I've drawn attention to conflicts, tensions, but just at some points lack of connection. Lack of connection between schools and universities, between the academic and the vocational, between theory and practice, even between the academic study and of media and the wider public debate. I think there's a real need to have some better dialogues in that respect. So, perhaps the summit, not having been to a media education summit before, perhaps the summit is one place in which those dialogues might begin to happen. Let's see.